Greetings, students. And in the last part of the chapter, we're going to talk about water's life-supporting properties. In our previous lesson, we talked about the unique properties of the structure of water, how it's a polar covalent molecule, and how those polar covalent molecules are attached to each other by hydrogen bonds. But those hydrogen bonds play a big role in some of the cool and unique properties that water has. First of all, water exhibits the property of cohesion, which means it has the ability to stick to itself. It also exhibits the property of adhesion, which means its ability to stick to other substances. And you can see this demonstrated here in the graduated cylinder. See the curvature of the water here? That's called a meniscus. And that phenomenon occurs because the water sticks to the side of the graduated cylinder. So when you're reading the graduated cylinder, if you're reading a volume of liquid, you have to actually read the bottom of the meniscus to get an accurate reading. So water sticks to itself, that's cohesion. It sticks to other things, that's adhesion. This property of cohesion also affects water's surface tension. And surface tension is a measure of how difficult it is to break the surface of a liquid. And that's what we did with the penny lab. I know a lot of you were kind of astounded at how many drops you were able to actually get on the top of the penny because the water is able to hold itself together. So some of you predicted like 7, 8, 10 drops, and we're finding you were getting 50 or 60. This is what surface tension looks like here. You can see the water molecules are all attracted to each other, and they create this kind of like horizontal force here, this almost like buoyant force, which creates like this skin effect on the water, which can hold things up like this water strider here. That's surface tension. Water also has what's called a high heat capacity, which means its ability to store energy is pretty great because, like, let's think as an example, in the summer when you're going swimming, you go in the afternoon and the water feels nice, cool, and refreshing, and then at night you go back in the pool and the water feels like it's much warmer. But the water hasn't really changed temperature at all. It's the surrounding air that's changed temperature in relation to the water. Water takes a very long time to increase or decrease temperature because water really holds its energy. So when water absorbs heat, hydrogen bonds are broken, and then the water molecules can move more freely. That's how water turns from, say, a liquid to a gas. You know, when you boil it, it helps break those bonds up, and then the water escapes as a gas. When the temperature of water decreases, hydrogen bonds are formed. And so, like, that's how you move from the gaseous state to liquid state and then to the solid state. The fact that water has this high heat capacity makes it really, really great for living things because it helps organisms maintain homeostasis. It even really helps the planet maintain homeostasis. Think about our planet. It's covered with like 75% water. So it kind of helps regulate the temperatures of our planet from like going crazy, okay? Because it takes a long time for water to change temperature. And in the case of human beings like us, one of the properties of water that we take advantage of to help us keep us safe and help us maintain homeostasis is sweating. And how does sweating relate to the properties of water? When a substance evaporates, the surface of the liquid that remains behind starts to cool down. That's because as the water evaporates from a liquid state turns to the gaseous state, as you sweat, as the water starts to evaporate, it actually takes that heat with it. So it's actually removing the heat from your body. So the formation of the water droplets on your skin, that's the first part. But to actually get that cooling effect, it has to evaporate off of you. And once it evaporates, it actually removes that heat from you, which helps you maintain homeostasis and stay cool. Problem is, if you're doing a lot of exercise or sports, you have to make sure that you're drinking lots of water and you're staying hydrated because that water is evaporating and leaving you, and you have to replace it because if you start to run low, then your body can't maintain its temperature and you'll start to heat up and you could get heat stroke or something like that. And how about this little adage? Oh, it's not the heat, it's the humidity. That's actually true when you think about it. Why? Heat is heat, right? But in certain places like here in Florida, you can sweat really, really bad because it's so hot. But the problem is the humidity, all the moisture in the air is saturated, which makes it very difficult for your sweat to evaporate. So if your sweat can't evaporate, you can't properly cool down. See, it's not just the process of sweating. Those sweat droplets have to evaporate into the air. That's how they remove the heat from you. Here's a picture of a gentleman sweating right here. You can even see it around him here. Now, what's interesting about water is it can exist really in all the states of matter. You find it in all the states of matter in our atmosphere. But one of the coolest properties of water is what's called the density anomaly. And as we already said, as water starts to cool or lose some of that heat, as it's giving off some of that heat, new hydrogen bonds are able to be formed. And so as these hydrogen bonds form and it moves into the solid state, these hydrogen bonds will bond with their neighbors, but they create this lattice work with the individual molecules spread more apart than they would normally be for the other states of matter. So in a two equally sized volumes of water, the liquid water would have more molecules in it than the solid version. That's why the solid version, the ice version, floats, because it's less dense. It has less molecules in the surrounding area. So it looks something like this. Notice these are two equal volumes, but look how many more molecules are in the liquid version. Now, this is very important. Again, another emergent property of water that's important for living things. We've already talked about evaporative cooling for organisms like us, maintaining homeostasis, water in our bodies, maintaining the homeostasis of the planet. But this is another property that's very interesting. Look at what it does. It provides a habitat for the polar bears. Other living things, like, for example, let's say in a fresh body of water in the wintertime, forms a layer of ice on top. The water is less dense as a solid, so it sits on the top. It actually insulates the lake and keeps the remaining heat and trapped inside as much heat as there is in the water, but keeps the water from freezing so the organisms that are inside can survive. Now, one of the other unique cool properties about water is its ability to readily dissolve other substances. We call it the universal solvent. It will dissolve more substances than anything else because it is polar. And since it's polar, it has a slight charge to it. Remember, on the poles, a little negative side and a little positive side, which allows it to attract to other polar substances very, very easily. And also ionic compounds, because when you think about the ions themselves, there's charge as well. When we're talking about aqueous solutions, we're talking about solutions whose solvent is water. Okay? And remember, water in an aqueous solution acts as the solvent, which means it's the one that's doing the dissolving. And the solute is what you're adding in. So like, let's say, for example, I'm making a glass of salt water. That would be an aqueous solution because it's made of water, basically. The solvent would be the water, and the solute would be the salt. And it would look something like this. Look how perfectly an ionic compound dissolves into water, because you have the ions, which have a charge, and they're attracted to the polarity of the water molecules. Now, sometimes you do have issues with water. It's not perfect. It doesn't readily attract non-polar substances like, for example, oil. You see in this picture here, the oil and the water do not mix very well. I mean, the oil is less dense, so it sits on top, but the other issue is the fact that it's non-polar, so there's no place for the water to attract. So you need to introduce a substance called a surface active agent, which helps facilitate the attraction of polar molecules to non-polar molecules. And an example of that would be like dish soap. That's why you use it at night when you're cleaning your frying pans and your cooking utensils. Now, something interesting that you might not think about in terms of biology, like, why would I talk about this? This is chemistry stuff. Yes, it is. But it's also important to understand acids and bases in terms of living things, because acids and bases, those kind of things affect life, whether it's their surrounding environments, like an organism that lives in a body of water, or for us, pH levels trigger responses in the body. And so it is important as a biologist or a marine biologist or many different biological life science fields to have an understanding of acids and bases. Okay. So what is an acid? An acid is a chemical agent that releases hydrogen ions when they're added to water. This is a hydrogen ion. Bases are chemical agents that release a OH or hydroxide ion when dissolved in water. And some of the properties of acids include they turn blue litmus paper red, they have a sour taste, and they have the ability to corrode metals. Bases, on the other hand, turn red litmus paper blue, they taste bitter, and they have a kind of a slippery feel to them when you come in contact with them. Now, scientists will use something called the pH scale, which stands for potential hydrogen. And that scale describes how acidic or basic a substance. What it's basically talking about is the amount of hydrogen ions that can be readily dissolved by the solution. And so let's look at the pH scale on the next slide, but let's also talk about this, for example, a buffer. A buffer is a special type of chemical agent that helps minimize changes in pH. Because, for example, like for a living thing, a dramatic change in pH can be very dangerous. Buffers are chemicals that could be mild acids or mild bases that can actually help regulate pH changes so they're not dramatic changes. This is what the pH scale looks like here. In the middle here, you have pure water, which is 7. That's neutral. You have a balance of hydrogen and hydroxide ions. And so remember, the pH scale, you're talking about the ability of the particular chemical agent to release hydrogen ions. The more hydrogen ions that it releases, the more acidic it is. And what's kind of interesting is the more acidic it is, the lower the pH numbers. The further you get away from 7 towards 0, the more acidic a substance is. So like these, on this end here, these are very, very dangerous acids. Where on this side here, these are more mild acids. And then the opposite holds true for bases. The further you get away from 7, the less hydrogen ions you have and the more hydroxide ions you have. So you can see the difference here between there and there. And what's kind of interesting about this case, the number actually goes up. So the further away from you get to 7, like 12, 13, 14, these are very dangerous bases. And then here are some mild bases like seawater, like when you go to the beach and you're in that water there. Okay. But remember, pure water, not necessarily what you get out of the tap, is balanced in terms of the hydrogens and the hydroxides. Now here's a great case study here, example of why we study acids and bases. And this is how the chapter began. We talked about one of the side effects of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in addition to climate change and global warming, is the impact that carbon dioxide is having on our oceans, which again, we already established is a product of fossil fuel combustion. As it increases in the atmosphere, it is leading to global climate change, which we've already talked about. But another thing scientists don't really talk about, you don't hear on the news, it's not as exciting, but it's an impact, is a lot of that carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans. And so if you're talking about 25% of all that CO2 being absorbed by the oceans, you can't not expect some type of effect to happen to the oceans. And we call this ocean acidification. Because what it's doing is it's slowly lowering the pH of the ocean, which is bad for all the living things because it affects like the fishes. They don't have the ability to as efficiently exchange gases or exchange waste materials, that kind of stuff. But it also has a dramatic effect on organisms that like to create shells. Because one of the things that organisms that create shells like corals and certain types of mollusks and stuff, they need carbonate ions, which are usually readily available in the ocean. That's one of the raw materials that they use to grow a shell. But the problem is the hydrogen ions that result from the water becoming more acidic, those free-floating hydrogen ions like to attach to the carbonate ions and produce something called bicarbonate. And so once it's in bicarbonate, that reduces the carbonate ions available for the corals and the other seashell building animals. So what does that mean? That means they can't build their shells. And so scientists have actually done experiments, and this is what they found. The more available carbonate there is, the faster the rate that calcification can take place, which is the process of building the shell. But notice, as the levels go down, so do the rates of calcification. So that's something we have to think about, is we're not only affecting our climate, we're affecting where we live, we're also affecting the ocean. We don't see it below the water, but we're affecting the animals there as well. And so to close with the theme we've also been recurring throughout the chapter so far is this idea of emergent properties, which we talked about already in some examples of living things, how particular properties lead to other types of processes being possible. Like, for example, scientists are so fascinated in space, I'm not looking for the word, I don't have the right word here, but they're so consumed with trying to find water somewhere because they feel like water would be a clue of the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Because as far as we know, water is necessary for life. And all those emergent properties of water that we talked about that make it so unique, cohesion, adhesion, high heat capacity, the density anomaly, all these things that we talked about together collectively make water necessary for life. They facilitate our chemical reactions. They help us maintain homeostasis, those kind of things. So that is why we believe if we're able to find water out there, we may be able to one day find life or find a place to be able to support life as a potential place we might explore one day. So that concludes our chapter here. Make sure that you go through this list here. You should be able to do all these things here. Numbers 1 through 8. Don't forget to look over the full presentation, any of the practice sheets we did, the labs we did, the microscope lab, the surface tension lab. Go to the book, look over the study area, do the practice questions, do the study guides that we did in class, do the practice Kahoot in the module. And if you have any questions or anything, feel free to shoot me an email.